Good stuff.
We'll have to bring it back in. Welcome, greetings, and salutations, everybody. Really excited to have this discussion with Dr. Asatar Bair today. He has a PhD in economics, which he received from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I think I heard him talk actually that he studied with or under Dr. Richard Wolff there, which is pretty interesting. I'd love to pick his brain about that a little bit if we get time. He currently teaches at Riverside Community College in Southern California, right?
Yep.
He also has a YouTube channel where he teaches classes on meditation, I think heart-centered meditation in particular. He is a proud communist, a man after my own heart there, and also wrote a book, Prison Labor and Economic Analysis. I haven't read it yet, but it does sound really interesting. Kind of seems like the gist of it is prison labor in the United States, prison labor in the United States could be understood as slavery. Just a quick introduction. Anything I missed or you would like to add?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the program. I appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion. And yeah, I mean, the other thing is that I'm active on Twitter, and people want to find me there.
Yep, that's how I came across you. Yeah. Yeah, so today I just wanted to have you on the channel to talk about the USSR, communism, and Joseph Stalin in particular, because I think as we were chatting before we went live, there's a lot of just a whole lot of propaganda and misinformation about Joseph Stalin in particular, definitely obviously from liberal and conservative circles, but I would say even from people who identify as leftists or even socialists, frankly, to just really not take into account the great contribution that Stalin made to, socialist theory. And then he was also a, revolutionary leader. And under the USSR, the standard of living just increased dramatically for the people there. And I was watching a talk that you gave last night on, your YouTube channel about the economic development of, pre-Soviet Russia, what that looked like compared to what Stalin and the USSR was able to accomplish. So if you could just give a little bit of background, what that looked like, and what Stalin and the USSR was able to accomplish for improving the material conditions in people's lives so dramatically, frankly.
Absolutely, yeah. So the historical context there is like what we now recognize as like the end of the Russian Empire under the Tsar. The Russian Empire had expanded and had been like pretty successful from like the 1600s to like the late 1800s, whereupon it began to falter because Russia was a late industrializer. That the Industrial Revolution begins in England and to some extent perhaps the Netherlands, but and then sort of spreads from like England in terms of industry. The Netherlands is a leader in terms of merchant capital. So these are the places where capitalism really kind of first develops, and then basically kind of spreads south and east. And Russia was just arguably the most backward country in Europe, and that became apparent when they started to have conflicts with economic powers that were far more developed, right? Like Japan, for example. And so there was a lot of dissatisfaction, among like in Tsarist Russia, because people were like, our country's getting screwed, like, and just incompetence of the Tsar on a kind of national, like on a national chauvinist type of level,
Okay.
But there's a lot of like economic problems and a lot of suffering that also takes place. And this is really connected to the, like one of my interests in economics, and particularly in studying places like the Soviet Union and China, is how are these like primarily agrarian societies, right? Primarily agriculturally dominant societies, how do they make this transition to industrialize, right? You know, it's off the map of like the kind of pre-Soviet Marxist canon, you know, which said, hey, the contradictions of capitalism are going to develop, sharpen, and heighten until they blow up, you know, like
Yeah.
that's. And so, you know, Marx and Engels really thought, I mean, like in the Communist Manifesto, you'd like read the prefaces and stuff, you know, like they really thought it would happen in Germany. That was, you know, and Germany was in advance. It wasn't that far behind England, you know,
Yeah.
as an early adopter of capitalism. Um, and so, yeah, you know, that made a certain amount of sense to think that. And actually, the revolution came quite close in Germany and was barely averted. Um, you know, so I'm not mad at them for being wrong, not at all. You know, like this is
Yeah.
very hard to predict. Um, but I think it was, you know, it's been a kind of surprise and a thing to deal with in the literature ever since then. Like, what happens when there's a revolution, but you don't really have capitalism? You know, like you have
Mhm.
a small, marginal, poorly developed capitalism concentrated in the cities to the extent that it exists, and
Yeah.
that was the situation in both Tsarist Russia and you know, China, like under the warlord period and whatever under the KMT. Um, so you know, that's just interesting. And then
Mhm.
how do you proceed with that, right?
Yeah.
What do you do? But I want to make sure I'm answering the question, because the question is about like how did that change people's lives? We just have to understand that like because of the extremely unequal distribution of land, right, and because most people, like 92% of the labor force is in agriculture in Tsarist Russia,
Yeah.
and because like this tiny, I mean, Russia's a huge country, right? Like, and this tiny number of aristocratic families, only about 30,000 families,
Oh, wow.
owned like almost all the land, you know?
Wow. Yeah.
So it's extremely unequal. And, you know, you had you know, this transition out of feudal serfdom that occurred very late relative to other European
Mhm.
countries. Russia had a very brutal form of serfdom, which was more akin to slavery. Like normally, the difference between these is that serfs are bound to the land; they have their tenure. You know, like
Yeah.
so you can sell serfs. You know, like that,
Mhm.
versus you can sell slaves. That wasn't true in Russia. You know, the serfs could actually be sold, and so
Oh,
you're like,
wow.
wow, what a brutal system, you know.
Mhm.
And they still had the corvée system where they're like going and providing labor, or you know, you could call it like rent in the form of labor, right? That's the corvée. um, and you know, that still existed like up until like 1861, and you know, that's a very late relative to other places. And you could see the effects of this because, you know, what do you have here? You have serfs that are doing so much surplus labor for their landlords. um, the landlords are taking, you know, 50%, 70%, you know, like of their product of their labor, and that puts serfs, and millions of them, right? I'm tens of millions of them, puts them right on the edge, you know,
Yeah.
right on the edge of survival. And this is why you saw like the life expectancy under the czar is like 35, you know, like that's unbelievable. I mean,
Yeah.
like just consider like how many children and infants are dying routinely, you know. Medical care is basically non-existent, like in terms of if we talk about the vast majority of the countryside,
Mhm.
there's zero access to doctors, you know. um, and so like and you know, people are on the edge of, you know, you get a famine, you know, quite easily if there's a drought, anything. And there's
Mhm.
tons of these in Russian history. I mean, you are creating you're creating the ideal situation for people to starve with
Yeah.
that kind of distribution of land, right? Because, you know, how do, like, if people wanted to improve their output, if they wanted to improve their productivity and thereby improve their standard of living, you know, like, of course you do, right?
Yeah.
How do you do that? Where do you get the like capital to invest in your little tiny plot of marginal land that you have because of, you know, these and these historical conditions, right? Um, where do you get that? Like, and of course the answer is you don't, right? So,
Mhm.
you know, like agriculture is like extremely undercapitalized. And I had an old picture that I showed in the lecture of somebody plowing like pulling the plow. I think this is the picture. I don't know. I looked at a lot of these, pulling the plow like by hand, right? They're
Yeah.
it's a wooden fucking plow or whatever, like just to show you, that's the level of technology that we're dealing with. And the Soviets were like, that is the very first thing that needs to change, because they rightly saw agriculture as that's the current state of the economy.
Yeah.
And, the pressing need that we have is industrialization, but we can't industrialize unless we produce more surplus in agriculture. So, like I have another lecture where, I have like one that's sort of an overview of the whole history and economic development. And I have another one that's just about agriculture because, like I said, it's sort of an interest of mine. It's a relatively new interest. I wasn't interested in it when I was like in grad school. But just in terms of like you kind of have to get into, like if you're going to study the economics of USSR and China, you kind of have to look at that and how do they change the situation that's so bound up with like, history and tradition and all these things and it's such a destructive structure. Like you can't leave it in place,
Yeah.
and then what do you do, but yeah, I mean, so what they did was they abolished private ownership of land, but because of the chaos, they left a lot of the relationships kind of unchanged. Like they didn't have the ability to really deal with it because, of course, they had this horrible civil war that was funded by outside powers, including the United States. It's not very widely known in the United States that the U.S. invaded, right away, like right after the revolution.
Was that with actual U.S. forces, or was that just supporting like the white army?
They're supporting the white army, but yeah, I mean, it's an invasion. I mean, like,
yeah, for sure.
Even like Wikipedia admits this. Not always the best source on this stuff, but that's the fact. Now, is it the most serious invasion or whatever, or is it like maximum effort or something? The United States Armed Forces in 1917, 1918 was very different than it was like in, say, 1944 or whatever. The United States went through a huge military buildup to enter World War II. So it's not like what we're thinking of now,
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting too, just because we don't often, think about the, Civil War post-revolution there and just the economic and human toll that it took on the country and just how even the productive forces, what they were in Tsarist Russia, were just really, decimated by that war. And it's maybe that's probably, one of the reasons that they had to, introduce state capitalism, because they had to, develop the productive forces and able to kind of meet the needs of the people. And like you were saying, the, Tsarist Russia was so heavily dependent on agriculture, 90+% of the workforce was there, just how brutal of a form it was. And then how they were able to complete the USSR and, under Stalin in particular, were able to industrialize so quickly, and just how the conditions that they're able to do that under, while still, obviously facing these external threats throughout their kind of the entire reign of the USSR. It's just a real, accomplishment, but it's never portrayed as such. It's always Stalin's such a brutal dictator. The USSR was so horrible, like he killed millions of people, like the Gulag, all of these canards just keep, without actually analyzing the material conditions and how they proved so dramatically for a massive amount of people. And I actually saw an article recently, this poll came out, a plurality of people in Russia would actually like to see it return to a Soviet style of government, which frankly makes total sense if you lived, under the capitalist system, 91, post 91 in Russia. I mean, the people's standard of living has decreased. Under the USSR, people had universal health care, education, pensions, paid vacation, all of these, these metrics, in that, lecture you're talking about, so that we use to measure progress under social sciences, improve dramatically. So it's like we're doing ourselves a real disservice not to actually analyze what actually happened, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too because, if I bring up statistics, so first of all, yeah, I used to teach statistics, like I have a lot of training in that, and but like when I bring up macro statistics, it's hard. I notice it's kind of hard for people to understand, and because it's a certain mode of thinking or whatever, um, and also people are sort of like, well, that's not due to socialism, that's due to industrialization,
Yeah.
and I'm like, well, yeah, well, socialism made industrialization a top priority, like, and industrialization is not some different magical thing like, oh, I just got struck by industrialization. Whoa, like a bolt out of the blue, like, no, industrialization proceeded under a plan, like, and that plan made it happen in an unbelievably short amount of time. Like you have never seen that kind of rapid industrialization at any point in history. So
Yep.
that's like, what took a few hundred years to develop in England, in the Soviets did in 5, like,
Yeah.
and that's just unreal. And I mean, like, forget the ideological whatever, like, just study that like as a thing, like, look at that, right? And what, in the economics literature, you do find that, you do find people that just sort of are like, this is interesting, this is unusual, this is unprecedented. But in sort of common academic fashion, it's all like, well, like that kind of,
Trying to explain it away almost.
and not explain it away, just not explain it in the blunt fucking terms that it
Okay.
needs to be explained, and that's kind of like where I come in, like when I'm, I can do that scholarly mode. I can be like, well, a careful analysis suggests da da da, like I can do that, but I
Yeah.
don't do that on Twitter. On
Yeah.
Twitter, I'm like, this is a blood sport,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna treat it like that, because
Mhm.
like, it's not, I don't know, um, it's not like, here's my list of footnotes or whatever, like
Yeah.
it's more like, look, you don't understand the depth of lies that are told about this too. Like, I
Yes.
mean, unless you've looked into it, like, you just don't. It's not like this prior thing that says like, oh wow, generations of scholarship, of anti-communist scholarship that is just straight to finish lies,
Mhm.
heavily funded, and is
Mhm.
now dominant. Like that's the situation,
Mhm.
So like, that's nobody's prior, like our prior is, hey, scholars are unbiased and they, study things carefully and they, basically give us the facts, and yeah, maybe they disagree about a few things, but like if you look at the kind of broad things they agree on, like, that's a kind of our, liberal whatever. Um, and maybe that's true for lots of fields, but when it comes to political economy, that just could, and especially when it comes to anything related to socialism, that just, you have to throw that away. You have to throw that in the trash. You have to be like, everything I know, everything I've been told is
Mhm.
is probably wrong, and you have to proceed in this just like grand kind of open-mindedness, like,
Mhm.
maybe I don't know anything. I mean, that's a good way to proceed if you want to learn a lot in a hurry
For
anyway.
sure.
you know?
Sure. Yeah, but yeah, unfortunately, yeah, like you're saying, there's just so much propaganda, lies, and misinformation that's out there about the USSR and what they were able to accomplish. And obviously, I think it's, to serve a purpose that, socialism has never worked, whether it was in the USSR or China or Cuba or, anywhere else, because, then it's like, well, if they were able to, give everybody healthcare, education, housing,
Yeah,
retirement, paid vacation, then it's like, well, maybe in the capitalist countries like the United States, we would start demanding that for ourselves instead of like, well, nothing ever worked over there. It was just authoritarianism, gulags, repression, all of these horrible things, not actually having a more balanced perspective. And that tweet of yours that went viral a couple months ago, you were saying, Stalin is neither sinner nor saint, but he was this, revolutionary figure. And under his, leadership and past that, the USSR was able to accomplish a great deal. And to quote from one of your slides, socialism in the USSR improved people's lives by every single measure of well-being known to social sciences. That's kind of an important thing to understand and unpack. And a lot of people are just very reactionary when they hear about the USSR or Stalin, and think if you identify, on the left or a socialist, I think that's, very problematic to not actually look at what was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the kind of takeaway, right? Because history is full of details, right? Like economics, full of details, politics, right? You have to have some kind of narrative frame that organizes that, right? And you're trying to form that, right? Like, how do you characterize this and whatever? And so, like the one that we've inherited from, decades, like almost 100 years of concerted propaganda, or actually a little bit over, right? So, is like, well, socialism was a failure, and it was unfree, and it made people starve and whatever. And I'm like, wrong, wrong, and fucking wrong. Like, I mean, that's not the takeaway. That's just not. It's not a factual. Like, that is a faith-based thing that you're repeating, and like, so that's why I'm like, look, the takeaway is socialism has saved and improved hundreds of millions of lives. I mean, that's the takeaway. And like you want to tell me oh, the Soviets might have massacred, people in Poland, the Katyn massacre or whatever, which is actually also disputed. And, this is one of these historical foggy things. And that means the Soviets were evil. And I'm like, evil is not a word that we use a lot in the social sciences because it's not theology, like we're not concerned with good and evil. We're concerned with results, we're concerned with being able to measure stuff. And morality and values come into that. Absolutely. We're human beings, and you can't act like there's, you don't have values. You can't act like you don't have that. But like to, I don't know, to be like, yes, now we're going to study history and discover who is evil. Like what? That's not. It's just such a ridiculous, like even the idea that we would accept that as a premise, is just absolutely absurd. But then when you look at the actual results, you're like, let's do a thought experiment. Let's say there was somebody who was really evil, and they took over the earth, and just ran it authoritarian, and they're like, and you know what we're going to do? We are going to feed everyone. We're going to eliminate starvation. 9 million people starve globally every fucking year. I mean, and that's a crime against humanity. That's clear. That is structural violence.
Yep.
It's an enormous, incomprehensible death toll, right? It's 25 to 30,000 people. And by the way, there are 80% women and children that perish every single day, right? That is just absolutely stunningly barbaric.
Yes.
So like our, mythological supervillain that's taken over the earth eliminates starvation, eliminates homelessness, eliminates joblessness. And you're like, oh, what an evil villain. What I mean?
Expectancy also increased as well.
I mean, yeah, you're going to make a lot of people's lives way better off, And so like, even if you're evil and power hungry, like, I actually don't care that much. Like, I care more about what are the results, what are the consequences. I care about that more than I do like, what is somebody's intentions and what is somebody's personality like and whatever, like, who the fuck cares, like, I mean, any like, you look at any national leader, and you're like, well, they have some appealing personal traits and they have some unappealing ones. And, like you could say that of Winston Churchill or FDR just as easily as you could of Stalin. Yeah. But in every case, I'm like, that doesn't interest me, like, I'm not a biographer, I don't care about that. I care. I'm into political economy, like, and so what I want is, it's not about the personalities, right? It's about what is life like for the masses of people, and especially the average person, the most vulnerable.
Yes.
I think that is really strong in terms of the grand tradition of Marxism, like beginning with Marx and Engels, and saying, economic theory is already very concerned and very interested in the perspective of the rich,
Hmm. Hmm.
and where's the economic theory that focuses on the average person, right? And because it needs to be created. Um, so I think that kind of just general outlook is important because we still have that today. We still have like almost everything that's in the field basically takes the view of the very rich.
Hmm. Yeah, I also find it, yeah, interesting too, just this kind of discussion around, authoritarianism or repression under socialist systems. And I kind of come from this perspective that some of that is probably going to be needed just to repress certain, reactionary forces that would,
Yep.
a return to the feudal capitalistic order. Whether that's from external or internal threats. So I was just kind of curious of your perspective about that in particular.
Well, yeah. I mean, every state does that. I like this is why I don't like the term authoritarian.
Okay.
It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean? There's police.
Yeah.
Like every society has police. Like they
Yeah.
have military. They protect their borders. They
Yeah.
restrict entry and exit because that's every country. Like
That's true.
you want to call that authoritarian? I mean, like, so like, does it matter to me whether a country has like half a dozen private organizations that own the media, or whether they have one that's the state? Like,
Mhm.
is that really a critical distinction? I mean, like, if you look at the United States, look at the media, like, it's all state media. Like
Yep.
the fact that it's privately owned doesn't matter effectively in terms of the message. Like
That's true.
the New York Times, parrots what the government wants, what the State Department wants, and the connections between the Times, like, and the State Department are legion and very well known.
Yeah, it's like
And
that.
not even really all that covered up. Like
Hmm.
nobody's, but because we've been told, oh, that's so important, we have like an oppositional media. We don't. That's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
for
Um,
sure.
and just to focus on that and be like, oh, well, see, there's CNN or there's Fox News, and it's like, oh, wonderful, that's great to have two flavors of pro-imperialism.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, I mean, what is it, like 6 companies own 90% of the media in the US, and like you're
Yeah,
saying, they're more or less just stenographers for the US government. And the spectrum of debate that's allowed, whether it's CNN or Fox News, is going to be very small. You're not going to hear anti-imperialist or pro-socialist or communist guests or discussions on that. So I think that's a point well taken. And yeah, like you're saying, every country has a police, has a military. They protect their borders. Yeah, so under a socialist one, under the USSR, it'd obviously be yeah, no different. And then so I just wanted to yeah, get into Stalin a little bit more, kind of what his political theory and outlook was like, and what he implemented under his time as kind of leader of the USSR, which was from about, what was that, 2024 to 53, right?
yeah, yeah. You know, I think so. One of the things that I think is interesting in terms of studying that is looking at Stalin's addresses to the Soviet Congress.
Okay.
Um, like address to the 17th Congress is a good one, for example.
Okay.
And like when you read this, and this is like a speech, like it's a long and
Mhm.
detailed. Like, I mean, in terms of like it's a very different than I think what we think of if we think of a leader giving a speech today.
Okay.
And it's like a very detailed assessment of like, here is the progress that we have made, and celebrates that, right? Like, here's what's happening to industrial output. It's going through the roof, and we're very proud of that, and um, and here's what it was, here's what it was in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War. Here's where it was under the Tsar. here's what we've been able to do together, wow, right? So there's that. But then there's another theme, which is, how does this connect to Marxist theory, which has brought us together, right? So you also see that, like, in that same address, it's like, well, where are we? Because we have this grand overarching vision, that's very strong out of Marxism, and even kind of predates Marxism in a lot of ways, right? So the idea that there's something called communism, very old idea, and that this involves a society that is just very, very different than the one that we know, and is better, and that it doesn't have the oppression, that doesn't have the exploitation, that doesn't even have things like money, right? That doesn't have classes. And that's just kind of this wonderful but kind of mind-bending dream, that
Mhm.
has been around for a long time,
Yeah.
but gets developed, and because Marxism, um, you know, introduces new concepts, like the concept of necessary and surplus labor as a tool of understanding society, and saying, who takes the surplus? What do they do with it? How do they use it to manage the contradictions of society? How do they use it to maintain their position as, an elite, right? Um, and what are our options for doing that differently, right? Like, because the pressing need of the USSR, and they're very explicit about this. Stalin is very explicit about this, right? He's like, we need to industrialize, and why? Because look, we just were, horribly victimized by World War I, by Imperial Japan, by like this litany of defeats and humiliations, you know, um, and like, and that's not going to stop, like the capitalist world is, wants to either make us a colony, um, or right. I mean, this comes right out of Lenin, and Stalin obviously studies with Lenin, considers Lenin to be and he is, to be a major figure in understanding how is capitalism changing and developing, through the first few decades of the 20th century. Um, and really understands that, like, yes, there is a massive pressure, to colonize Russia, to control Russia, and we need to defend ourselves, and so just having that kind of clarity about that, right? And he even says it emanates from Germany, like, and Stalin was talking about the dangers of fascist Germany way before anyone else was, right? I
Yeah.
mean, perhaps other European leaders were aware that Germany was doing a massive military buildup, but because it was focused on Eastern Europe, they were
Kind
like, you know what? This is going to fuck over the Soviets. Perfect.
of.
Go with this. Let's ignore this.
Yeah.
Let's make alliances. Let's just turn our face away from this. And I mean, so I don't think that they thought that the Germans would not just go toward the Soviets, like
Yeah.
that they would attempt to, conquer France and England and so on. But because otherwise, maybe they wouldn't have looked the other way quite as much. But clearly, there was like yeah, that's our attack dog over there,
Mhm.
And as long as they attack the commies, then we're good.
Nothing to worry about. Yeah. I also think that's kind of interesting too. Like often the huge role that the USSR played in defeating fascist Germany during World War II, and the huge,
Yeah,
massive amount of lives that were lost. Was it 20 plus million Soviets died
yeah.
fighting fascism? But no, it was actually, the United States. That's why, World War II was won, not this huge massive effort, by the Soviets. And yeah, I think that's kind of interesting too. I mean,
Well,
Stalin.
also that this is such a shift in terms of propaganda that it was widely understood, in the like immediate post-war period.
Yeah.
It was very widely understood. Like, you'd see these polls and whatever, like who was responsible for the defeat of this, and everyone, like majorities would be like, yeah, it's the Soviets, um, because that's true, right? Like, but over time, you see this perception starting to shift. This is one of the things that Loserdo discusses in his book about Stalin, which is excellent, which is called The Birth of a Black Legend or something like this.
Okay.
Very much worth, because it has that sort of historiography, like how did these perceptions change? It's like the propaganda is a cumulative effort, like it attacks these different points. And then, you're discussing things on hostile ground, and I mean, I just think that's poor strategy, like it's poor strategy to not recognize that this is an ideological battle, and there's rules to that, there's rules of engagement. And one of them is you don't let your enemy dictate what ground you fight on,
Mm-hmm.
But I
Sure.
feel like I'm wandering off topic because the question was about, the question was about, remind me.
Oh, just about kind of Stalin, his economic theory and development, and his kind of
Oh yeah,
contribution. Because,
okay.
like we had talked
Here's the
about
point I
before
wanted to
we
get
went
to about
live,
that.
like he has contributed like a great deal. And
Yeah,
this is my first Stalin book, and I don't think it will be my last. I even saw in one of the sources for one of your lectures, I think he had like a history of like the USSR or something.
yeah.
One of his
History of the
books.
Communist Party. Yeah,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
that's a good one too, because it's sort of, it gives this overview, and you get this sense of like what were their goals, and what did they do, and he talks a lot about agriculture in that, and it's useful, because so in terms of Marxist theory, like I would say where Stalin comes into this is again in these addresses, in this like as a political leader now, right? But not abandoning theory, but expressing it as a political leader, and in the context of like, here's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is already harder to understand, because like when you do pure theory, you don't have the difficulty of being like, well, let me also assess what the results of a society were. And assessing results is complicated. It's complicated. It's going to involve contradictions.
Yep.
Especially when there's a lot of struggle and violence, which of course there was.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to have to do a difficult weighing of things. You're going to have to be like, okay, these awful things happen. I mean, like you say, tens of millions of people died in this invasion, and how do you make sense of that horror, Um, Now, I think it's very hard, like if you want to make the case that, oh, World War II was completely Stalin's fault, and, and Stalin wanted this and plotted with Hitler and whatever. And I'm like, you have to ignore a lot of the historical facts in order to create that narrative. But people do it. People do it routinely. Like, I mean, people step to me on Twitter and are like, the Molotov-Ribbentrop, pact is that's proof that Stalin, Hitler, they created World War II. Like, no, it's not. What, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you don't know anything about this. Like,
Yeah.
this is that's one pact among a dozen or so with different European countries. So that kind of idea. So when I think about what, again, back to like this topic, I keep wandering off it, but like, how did Stalin contribute this? If we think about like what is socialism, what is communism, like within Marxism, we see that like Marx and Engels basically kind of use the terms more or less interchangeably, although there was some discussion of like there are levels, right? Or there are, phases, or, there's like a kind of early phase of communism or a more advanced, phase and whatever, right? And this morphs and changes under, to maybe to some extent Lenin, and to some extent Stalin as well, right? Because Lenin was very clear about this in the very early days, and of course, unfortunately, Lenin, didn't live that long after the revolution. But he had 5 years or whatever. It's more than what he thought he'd have, like so that's cool. But he said, basically, like he had written this wonderful book, actually very much worth reading, called The Development of Capitalism in Russia. I think he wrote that in 1905 or something. I don't remember the exact publication date, but he really analyzed that particular aspect, and as part of just the whole development of Tsarist Russia. And he had said, what do we need here to industrialize? We need state capitalism, and that was the phrase he used.
Mm-hmm.
And so under Stalin, that kind of, and there was already this concept called the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And that this was seen as a kind of, beginning part of the transition, right? Because the, in works like the Civil War in France, for example, right? There's this phrase that says like, the revolution cannot just adopt ready-made the existing government structures. I'm kind of bungling this quote, but you know what I'm talking about. Like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because the way that the state is set up, is set up for the interest of the bourgeoisie, right? And we need to completely redo that, right? And that's so you had this. These are sort of like concepts that are kind of in embryo, and they develop and mature, and Stalin contributes quite a bit to that, right? And you see that when he says, look, here's where we're going, right? We're going towards communism, and communism means, you know, uh, you know, to each according to need, right? From each according to ability, right? That's our, this ancient sort of phrase that's been around for a long time
Mm-hmm.
in the imaginary. And Stalin says, we aren't there yet. Where we are is you get according to your contribution.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, like, that's where we are, right? We are, you're going to be earning wages, right?
Mm-hmm.
But wages are a hallmark of capitalism,
Yep.
and everyone understands this. I mean, like, this is super widely understood, among the whole like Communist Party. So, but they see it as necessary, right? They're like, well, we need to develop capitalism, and yet we don't want to have it take forever, right? Because it is the anarchy of production. It's disorganized, like it's decentralized. If it's left on its own devices, it might grow depending on, I mean, if you're colonized or whatever, you're not going to grow very much. We know this, but like it grows organically over time. But we can turbocharge that. We can get this system organized, but it's going to be state capitalism, right? Like, but Stalin makes a very particular theoretical kind of shift here, where he says, let's just call that socialism, right? And that's interesting, right? Like, so how do we treat these terms? Do we treat socialism as that's part of the like utopian vision? And by the way, I'm not saying utopian vision as some kind of pejorative here, right? Like,
Okay.
every theory needs a utopian vision. You have to have that, because it's like the liberal vision is a meritocracy and free equal opportunity, right? Even though the outcomes won't be equal, the opportunities are equal, and that's what we're supposed to care about, right? Like, and democracy and freedom of expression, right? That's the kind of liberal. Those are the liberal views, and it's very fair to ask of the liberals, are those ideals being realized? Like liberals, tell me, do you think we're democratic here?
Yeah.
What are the obstacles to democracy as you see it? Like, please fill me in. Like,
Yeah.
don't just tell me, oh, this is the most democratic country in the world. I mean, so what? Like, tell me what progress is being made toward these high ideals, and don't tell me that they're not ideals, because they absolutely are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, communism has a different set of ideals, right? It says, it's not about equality of opportunity. It's about making sure that the most vulnerable members of society, don't like die and whatever like that. That the economy is meeting human needs, right? Um, I mean, I'm kind of like I'm departing from the lexicon a little bit, just in the interest of summarizing, right?
Yeah.
So, do we? The question, and I see these debates all the time still now, right? Which is, do we reserve the term socialism and put it alongside alongside communism as this, wonderful utopian ideal, or do we repurpose it and say, Well, socialism is the term that we're using for this transitionary phase where we go from an economy that's mired in exploitation, that's completely based on that,
Hmm.
to one that is so different from that that we can scarcely imagine it. You know,
Hmm.
um, how do you get there? What concrete steps you take? And maybe we should call that attempt socialism. Like, and I think it's really Stalin that kind of creates that idea. Um, but it's not just Stalin, because you have the democratic socialists and whatever. You have that whole tradition, a lot of it emanating from Germany. The idea that we could reform capitalism, and that might be a way that you know we get there. Um, so it's complicated because a lot of people are using this term,
Yeah.
and reactionaries are even using the term. I mean, like the Nazis, right? National socialism. So it gets very confusing very quickly. But I personally think that Marxism has the most rich and nuanced understanding of that, because it's so important, right? Like, you better, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really like important that we engage with that, and I'm not saying that everyone, like I'm presenting a certain view, which I think is consistent with that the kind of development that happened in the Soviet Union and also in China, um, that these are countries where they really thought deeply
Yes.
about these questions. And um, the problem, I think, in like the U.S. or maybe the Western left, if I could kind of characterize that, is um, that a lot of people just aren't aware of that, and aren't, you know, um, go around saying dumb bullshit things like China thinks it's communist or whatever. No, they
Yeah.
don't.
No,
There's
they don't.
nobody in the CPC that thinks that, like
Yeah.
we're just unaware of that because language and cultural barriers, or the weight of propaganda. So I do think it's important that we try to have that humility to just be like, how are people thinking about this in places that are very dedicated to the revolution, and also very pragmatic, and think a lot about and debate a lot about what do the concrete steps look like, even if they don't accord with our ideals. Like clearly the concrete steps in China are not, oh, abolish the commodity form. Like, no, I mean, because if you do that, then you give up on things like trade with the rest of the world.
Mhm.
um, Trade takes place on the basis of commodities. Like you,
Mhm.
so that's, and like, are they aware that that's a criteria of communism? Of course they are, right? They're very well aware of that, right? um, but they're like, it's not the time for that. So, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's something we should study and learn from, because
Mhm.
it's part of the tradition. I mean, you could disagree, but you should know what's been said so far. you know
Yeah, I think that's really interesting how you mention, yeah, Stalin, instead of calling it state capitalism, called it socialism, and what the USSR was able to, accomplish under that form of, socialism, where that, surplus labor was going to the state and they were able to improve one of your lectures, I was talking about, I think, and Tsarist Russia, like there was, it's like 14 or 16 people living in one apartment after the revolution. Everybody was guaranteed housing, life
yeah.
expectancy rose, infant mortality decreased. But yeah, we're never given a really nuanced, version of that. It's just always, bad things happen over there, famine, Stalin killed everybody. And same thing with the propaganda we hear now against China, even though, socialism with Chinese characteristics has been able to accomplish a great deal for so many people there. They've
Right.
eliminated, extreme poverty, and the, Chinese Communist Party is still, working out these, contradictions within China. I think, was it Xi Jinping recently called for, there maybe should be more wealth redistribution in the country. So I just find, there seems to be kind of some similarities with, people who, have this very negative view of the USSR and also, China currently. Do you kind of see that connection as well?
Oh yeah, I mean it's the same mountain of lies and propaganda that's told about China. It is more sophisticated now, because we the game has just been upped. I mean, like we're in the internet age now, right? Like
Yeah.
we have sources of information that people did not have in the 1930s and 1940s. Um, and that means that the propaganda effort has become far more sophisticated, far more difficult to parse. And you see this in, for example, this accusation, this absurd evidence-free accusation that there's a genocide against the Uyghur people of Xinjiang.
Yeah.
That is nonsense. And the more you look into it, the less support you find for it. But what it's everywhere in the media, and it's like this attempt to create this like overwhelming majority opinion and then shame anybody for questioning or looking at evidence,
Hmm.
um, and this is one of, I mean, even before that like viral Stalin tweet that, that shit post that went
Yeah.
nuts, started trending. I had kind of gotten a lot of attention for, I wrote maybe I don't know, a dozen like long threads about Xinjiang because I'm working on a book on it, which
Oh, cool.
unfortunately it's a little bit stalled. My project, I need to kind of revive it, but
Nice.
um, things have been kind of crazy for me in a bunch of ways. So that's to my fans, I apologize. I'm going to get this thing done. Um, but I started looking into this evidence, in the way that I do, which is, because I'm an economist by training, I
Mhm.
look at macro data, right? And what story does that tell? Um, and when you look at that story of the region, what you get is, this is a region that has extremely rapid economic, social, and human development, like China as a whole.
Yeah.
You don't see, this is not a region where they're like, fuck Xinjiang, like we're gonna, who cares? It's the Uyghurs, no, you don't see that at all. You see like the same kind of concern for how is the average person doing? What is what is growth like there, right? Um, and it's a region that has been growing at 8% a year for decades, right? I mean,
Wow.
and that has very rapidly and very markedly improved people's lives. I mean, people are, like average income is many, many times higher than it was just a few decades ago, right? So, and, like we're talking about in the range of 50 to 100 times higher.
Jeez. Wow.
Yeah, that is astonishing, right? And what you see is like, Uyghurs are, in leadership positions. They're in the Communist Party. They're, you know, this is not the kind of, and so what to create this charge, it's like, yeah, but look, it looks like what we know is bad from, the colonization of the Americas. It's like that, and it's like, first of all, no, it's not, and
Mhm.
secondly, that is not how you make a case. You don't say, oh, well, this looks a lot like something I hate. No, you that's bullshit. Like you have to actually do the work of
Yeah.
assessing the society, right? And of course, the people who are promulgating this narrative don't do that because the macro facts just aren't on their side.
Mhm.
Um, Instead, they cast aspersions and say, look at this translation of something that like horribly bad translation, and that proves that's a smoking gun. And you're like, why? Because you misattributed some quote and took it out of context, and it never meant that anyway. Like that's not a smoking gun. That's a that's just mudslinging. Like, but because the entire media is doing it,
Mhm.
you know but back to the point about this question of inequality, what I think is important to know about that is that this is an issue that has been discussed in China for decades, right? Like, so Deng talks about this, right? So Deng is this figure who goes this transition that occurs within the CPC from the Maoist era to the reform period, right? The post 78 period. And Deng is kind of like the founding father of that, right? Like, and Deng, says, look, we're going to kind of make this bargain with the capitalist world, right? We're going to make ourselves an attractive, low-cost producer. We are going to allow the capitalist world to exploit us, right? That's not the exact language he uses, but that's the flavor of it, right? But what are we going to get from that, right? We are going to climb the ladder of value in manufacturing. We're going to go from producing cheap, crappy, low cost, items. So it's like the difference between producing, like doing manufacturing, the way that the Industrial Revolution began, of course, is with textiles, right? So, and that was a great development, back in the 1600s and 1700s, right? But now we're at a different point, right? Now, if your economy is, if textiles all you have for industrialization, that's a pretty low level commodity to be producing because it's low value, right? So we want to go from textiles to electronics.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of steps in between,
Yeah.
And what do you need for that? Like you need a lot of technical knowledge, and you get that by producing, you get that by people need to know how to like produce. They need to know how to work these machines. They need to, they need to be educated in a technical manner. And China has just poured resources into that, right? Like, because part of that is education, part of that is just technical education. And they made a huge effort there, right? And and they've done that. They've climbed the ladder of manufacturing, and along the way, right? Deng says it's inevitable that we're going to get inequality. Some people are going to get rich from this. Mm-hmm. That is just inevitable, and this is one of the contradictions that we have to deal with, right? Because you don't think like, oh, there's going to be like this group of people that get rich, because that's called the bourgeoisie, right? Like we, and you don't want to see that happening. You don't want to see that forming. But for, complicated geopolitical and economic reasons, they're like, we will allow that to happen to a certain extent, but we will control it.
Yep.
And so this is all like, stuff that like, in order to understand, you have to understand the terms and understand the theory. And then you have to like struggle with it, like you have to like look at like, well, how is it, like even just the most basic things, like people throw out this term, dictatorship of the proletariat. What is that?
What does that look like? What does that mean?
Yeah, what does it really mean? And that's actually tough to answer, especially when you're in a position of power. And the question is like, what do you do? How do you keep power? And also, work towards the long range goals.
Yeah. And I feel like it can look different in different contexts, analyzing Lenin talked about looking at concrete analysis of the concrete conditions. So, I mean, it makes a whole lot of sense, and just, coming from a Marxist perspective, not being dogmatic, actually look at what's going on, what has happened, and then kind of applying your analysis to that and trying to work through those contradictions, as, China is currently doing, as the USSR, did. And we're coming up on the hour mark, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I've really enjoyed this chat. And if there's anything maybe you want to leave the viewers with about communism or socialism, or what we should be kind of working towards, from a Western left perspective, I'd have your parting thoughts on that.
Well, we have this idea that I think a very powerful idea from Marxism that says this is about a kind of awakening of consciousness and an understanding of who we are in a very different way. Like, who are we identifying with, right? Are we identifying with this tiny elite group of sociopaths that currently runs the earth? Are we hoping that we'll be one of them one day? We'll be billionaires? Because that's a fantasy. I mean, like, even if that does end up happening for you, it's a fantasy in the sense that we will not all get there, right? I mean, it's just an impossibility, like, in order to concentrate wealth, you have to deprive people of wealth, which is exactly what capitalism has done. So are we, how are we thinking of ourselves? Are we thinking of ourselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? Or are we thinking of ourselves as this global collective of working people? And that's just a very different thing, right? And what encourages that class consciousness? It's a whole bunch of things, so that's the thing that kind of fascinates me. But there's also this idea that development is encouraged by the structures of capitalism itself, and so that capitalism is itself the great radicalizer. And
Yeah. Yep.
that theory, what theory does is it sharpens the blade. It gives us a sense of, here's what's happened in the past, and here's what the successes have been, and here's the tragedies. I mean, there's a lot of tragedies in here. There's a if it hadn't been for the anti-communism of the last century, we'd be living in a very different world, and a better world, I think.
Yeah.
But this is the world that we have, right? So, we don't want to like fixate on the past, but we want to understand where it leaves us now. And that's a grand effort. That's something that we have to do collectively. All of this we have to do collectively, because that's
Yep.
the challenge, right? Like,
Yep.
I don't think we're going to proceed by having a different tiny minority run the world. We need to proceed differently, right? We need to,
Mhm.
I mean, a revolution is an authoritarian moment, right? So there does need to be a change of regime. There needs to be a change of power,
Yep.
um, and that's going to involve the exercise of power. I think that's pretty much inevitable. But
Yeah.
then the question is, what next, right? Do we have this? Um, we need to have mass consciousness. We need to have the voice of the people really being heard.
Hmm.
Um, we need to have an end to the lies.
Hmm.
Um, and this is partly why I'm so thrilled to see the development of left media. It's why I come on shows like this whenever I'm invited. I'm delighted that people want to have me on. It's fun for me. And I'm committed to helping where I can. I think we are all trying to figure that out, right? How do you contribute?
Hmm.
Um, and I will say to people, if they're interested in my work, I do have a Patreon page, like everyone does these days. If anyone wants to get involved and contribute, I'd appreciate that. I have a bunch of projects going, and I think, like everyone else, kind of overwhelmed between like my work life and like kind of what I consider to be the work that truly matters to my heart.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a struggle, that we face, right? Because we have to make a living,
Yes.
and yet we have to do something important with our lives, because otherwise,
What are
what's
we
the point?
doing? Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Awesome. Well, yeah, it's been a real joy and pleasure to have you on the channel. I felt like I learned a great deal, and I think whoever tuned in probably did as well. Yeah, and I
Thanks
put
so much
your
for having me. Delightful to talk to you.
yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.